For the last 11 years, the MonsterVerse has been something of the tentpole of the resurgence of Godzilla throughout modern cinema. It's had its share of ups and it's had its share of downs. It's had things that fans to this day are still split on discussing. One of them is MonsterVerse's incarnation of King Ghidorah. I have never been subtle about the fact that this is not my favorite Godzilla movie. In fact, it is my least favorite movie in the entirety of the MonsterVerse, despite the fact that I do talk about a lot of the positives of this movie. I will also critically blast it into next year, because I believe nothing is above reproach. I will be just as critical to this movie as I will be to any other part of the Godzilla series, whether that's Shin, another MonsterVerse film, the Showa era Heisei Millennium, or -1. Everything has aspects of it that need to be and deserve to be called out critically, just as much as things do deserve to have their credits and praise sung. Credit where credit is due, criticism where criticism is due. The ability to see the positive in what you don't like, and the negatives in what you do like, was something that I founded this channel on, because it's something people today seem to be kind of forgetting about. Which is why today's video is going to be on the trial of MonsterVerse King Ghidorah. Was he wasted? Was he not? We'll be looking at the for and against, the impact he has had on the MonsterVerse as a whole going forward, or lack thereof, his implementation, and many of the other side aspects of this entire discussion, because this is a lot more complex than one would think at first glance. Going into this, I actually had a very different opinion than where it ended up. Also, yes, if my voice does sound different, it is because I have just recently gotten over being sick. Don't worry, it is not Kung Flu. You're not gonna get rid of me that easily. But my voice is still gonna be messed up for some time. If you guys are enjoying all the Colossal Kaiju content we do around here, don't forget to subscribe for more, leave a like, comment your thoughts below, what you'd like to see us do in the next video. After all, members do get increased priority on making videos. Your recommendations are considered first and foremost. I guess the best way to start off with is really the things in favor of King Ghidorah having been wasted within the MonsterVerse. And these are going to be aspects of King Ghidorah himself in the MonsterVerse, his portrayal, and the involvement of the King of the Monsters' #1 rival, rather than simply just the movie King of the Monsters and many of its plot issues. That is an entirely separate video. The first one that most people tend to talk about is, of course, that he is Godzilla's biggest marketable rival. They blew his rival in the literal third movie of the MonsterVerse, the first movie where we even realized the MonsterVerse was an actual thing, and the second one with Godzilla in it. Remember, when Godzilla 2014 happened, we didn't realize it was gonna be as what it turned out to be. That only came after Kong Skull Island, where we saw the end credit scene showing Godzilla, Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah. This was the first movie to truly be made with that long series run in mind. And admittedly, I do think it was stupid that they took King Ghidorah and put him in the second movie starring Godzilla. They have even admitted that the MonsterVerse was somewhat largely set up purely to get Godzilla vs. Kong to happen, the movie that came after this movie. So they did clearly have much longer, or at least somewhat longer and grander plans than just movie, it did well, let's go make another one. Obviously, this was nothing like the scale of what the MCU was planned out for, where they had literally, a decade and a half building up to Thanos and Infinity War and Endgame. But it still reflected that they did have some elements of a long plan. And when it comes to big market rivals, you generally want to build up a little bit of time and a little bit of suspense for the audience, especially since, yes, the MonsterVerse now is succeeding at an incredible rate. It is huge, and it is well known across the entire world, especially across America, somewhere where I never thought it would be. But back then, no one even knew the MonsterVerse was a thing. Something like King Ghidorah would have needed a lot of build-up, not even just within movies, which honestly within movies is not as necessary as just simply marketing. The closest to this we got was, of course, that teaser at the end of Skull Island. But even as a result, the MonsterVerse was still largely known almost exclusively to the kaiju community. In fact, its notoriety beyond that only really came as a result of Godzilla vs. Kong, and something else we're going to be getting into a little bit later. While the last part dealt with the early growing pains of the MonsterVerse, this is something a lot more to deal with King Ghidorah and the MonsterVerse just as it is now. By this point within the entirety of the MonsterVerse, just about everything King of the Monsters established, with regards to things such as world building, has been almost entirely retconned away. The biggest of this is the Alpha Titan concept, something that we tend to talk a lot about here because it technically is still a part of the MonsterVerse, because it hasn't officially been scrubbed from existence, even though the way in which almost every movie has been operating since then has kind of ignored this entire idea. Godzilla is nowhere near presented to be the strongest undisputed ruler of Earth. A number of earthly titans simply don't listen to him, and while he does step in and put them in their place, the fact that they don't listen to him when, supposedly as the Alpha, they all obey him, even his supposed natural predators, such as the Muto, this is fairly indicative they've either completely forgotten about this idea or just want it quietly forgotten about, because as cool of an idea as it is, it did heavily restrict the way movies had to be written going forward. And as a character presence, for all the grandeur of King Ghidorah and all the pomp and ceremony they place upon him in the movie itself to make him an equal rival to Godzilla, which is kind of the whole point of that movie, the impact of his battle, which quite literally reshaped the entire world, and is the reason why the wider world knows pretty much about kaiju and Monarch can't hide them anymore, you don't really hear about it all that much. He never really had much of a lasting major impact, save for kind of Mechagodzilla, where his skull was used as the base for the control system. Also, it is worth noting, with Mechagodzilla, that I do believe using King Ghidorah as a base was actually quite clever. It also was a very good callback to Mechagodzilla 2. That's literally the entire reason why the framing at the end of Godzilla King of the Monsters is the way it is, with the King Ghidorah head, Kevin, being laying there, is a mirror of the opening of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, where Mecha King Ghidorah's technology is used to build Mechagodzilla 2. However, it wasn't exactly necessary. It is an extra neat little bit of fan service. However, the concept of just simply the inner Earth energy and Ren Serizawa's natural disposition to hate Godzilla are more than enough of an explanation for why Mechagodzilla went berserk. So it wasn't like they needed the idea of King Ghidorah to specifically create Mechagodzilla to bring Godzilla and Kong together to fight as allies, which ultimately was the entire point of Godzilla vs. Kong. Simply humanity being humanity would have been pretty much enough to do that. King of the Monsters itself as a movie is fairly heavy built on nostalgia and fan service. This is something else we're going to be going into in a video on its own, as fan service and nostalgia in and of themselves are actually not bad. Heck, Godzilla, Transformers, and a lot of series I love largely have fan service woven throughout their entire series. The difference is when the fan service becomes almost overriding and warps the series itself into something else entirely. A lot of what King of the Monsters does, I think, is actually very well done. Dr. Shen being a reference to the Shobijin, Serizawa's sacrifice, the fact that King of the Monsters essentially brings back the classic kaiju cast of Ghidorah the three-headed monster, but doesn't make it just a big-budget CGI remake of that movie, shows it understands its fan service extremely well. To take these past concepts, use them in new and different ways, to create a brand new idea. But at the end of the day, the movie is 85% nostalgia, trained together by stitching concepts and elements from previous movies together. With a significant part of that new, I hesitate to say quote-unquote uniqueness, being the blunt hammering on of the belabored and exceptionally poorly written climate change, and I hesitate to call it symbolism. Because that is not what it is at the end of the day. It uses King Ghidorah as an instrument of that narrative. The weird thing is, I legitimately can't tell if this movie is for the idea climate change is real because it advocates for the deliberate and total omnicide of humanity in the interest of the planet, or that it's actually mocking the entire idea of it to begin with, because at the end of the movie, Emma is wrong. It is actually made very explicitly clear that the kaiju are not naturally like this. They are being forced, one, by Emma to cause this because she awakens King Ghidorah, and in the end her whole goal was actually to reshape the Earth, and that the Earth was actually in balance prior to this, since the Titans actually fix all the damage King Ghidorah did, because of the power of friendship and Godzilla. Like, it's very hard to tell. It's also not hard to see why a lot of this was left and retconned out. Thank you, Wingard. May not like some of the decisions you made in some of the more recent MonsterVerse movies, but leaving this stuff out I think was definitely a good decision, despite the fact that yes, it did more or less erase the entire idea of what King Ghidorah was in the MonsterVerse. Third, and this is really from a much more meta-contextual perspective involving the actual movie performance itself. King of the Monsters is an undisputed, enormous failure, from purely a financial perspective. A lot of estimates put the losses at around to well over $100 million, and that is purely with regards to budget and advertising costs. None of that takes into account the amount of money needed to temporarily secure the rights of King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Rodan, which are very likely not included in that budget because they needed to be done before the movie was even made and started filming. I don't know exactly how much the rights for 3 of the world's most famous kaiju go for, but I know it is certainly not cheap, especially considering at this time the MonsterVerse was an unproven concept. Toho would have needed a lot of security to think that it was worth doing. Now, while this doesn't necessarily exclude them from, say, bringing some of these monsters back, after all, they brought Mothra back in Godzilla Kong the New Empire, they can't really bring King Ghidorah back in the same way. There's a couple of reasons for this, but the biggest one is that the not quite dismissive nature, but the fact that they simply gloss over the fact that Ghidorah is an alien. In King of the Monsters itself, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Godzilla Kong the New Empire, there is a total of 1 line about this entire thing, and that is the one where they say, yeah, King Ghidorah came from space. It has not been brought up at any other point, which is a generally very big indicator that they're just really not thinking about aliens going forward. I honestly thought that they were going to bring aliens in for Godzilla Kong the New Empire. I was surprised when they didn't, because with how dismissive it was, it felt, yeah, they're going to be bringing that in, because they just don't want to basically foreshadow things too much, because fans will pick things apart. After all, we picked apart the fact that Mechagodzilla was coming into Godzilla vs. Kong on literally the first trailer drop. But, nah, we were wrong on that. Paired up with the fact that they would need to completely explain where a second King Ghidorah came from. However, this itself does present a couple of issues, namely the fact that just simply bringing King Ghidorah back, outside of any sort of lore complications, which they already kind of seem to not really care about as much, would essentially be a tacit admission of, yes, we know we screwed up with King of the Monsters. We messed up King Ghidorah, please let us do it over. Fans generally don't really respond well to, you're just doing the same thing over again. The only other ways that I think they could possibly reintroduce King Ghidorah without having to resort to, oh yeah, another one just came from space, is if somehow the flesh regenerated, that just all the flesh was on the Kevin skull, was like melted down to a big vat and humanity cloned a new one, which one would be a lot weaker because one's younger, and second, it's a human clone. While at the same time, Godzilla has gotten stronger than like world-ending events by absorbing so much more power. Godzilla and King Ghidorah are nowhere near on the same level as they were before. Godzilla would massively outpower King Ghidorah. And the last of these is, with the movie assumedly taking the stance of, Climate change is real, despite the fact that, again, it literally advocates for omnicide of humanity to remedy it. Not exactly a good moral you want to go with. King Ghidorah doesn't exactly fit that bill. A number of Godzilla's past enemies would have actually fit this biosphere xenoforming idea much better. Again, while that is a pretty freaking metal idea, again, xenoforming hostily an entire alien planet to your own liking, and then when you're done with the kaiju that did all the work for you, you simply wipe them all out. There was already a kaiju that more or less did this. Orga, or rather the Millennium's plan back in Godzilla 2000, this was actually what they were doing. They were changing the atmosphere within Tokyo before Godzilla actually put a stop to them. Biollante, having been a plant kaiju human tribid, would have also made far more sense, and actually fit within the scope of humanity trying to mess with nature and harnessing the power of the kaiju for science and horribly backfiring, which is largely the entire running theme of the MonsterVerse. Ghidorah was always a sort of planet-hopping destroyer, just for absolute fun, going planet to planet, wiping them out for his own amusement. So while this incarnation did actually add a little bit more of a layers to it, and that it is simply he is expanding his territory and claiming Earth as his own to make it to his own liking, this change seems to have been in the interest of putting on that sort of climate change narrative, which has me a little worried. We know that Hollywood has been very, very big on putting in messaging for the audience. This is something we're going to be doing in another entire video on its own, but Hollywood has been very big on this for a long time. Same with not even just Hollywood, but really most entertainment outlets in the West, and utilizing them as essentially a hammer to get that message into the audience. The picking of Ghidorah in this worst possible interpretation of things seems to have been done just to get as many eyeballs and attention as possible. I really hope that this is not the case, since yes, in the past, kaiju have been used as representations and stand-ins for social discussion about things such as natural disasters and a simple social commentary. However, there has always been a layer of symbolism and separation to allow that commentary to come through, while again also not feeling like it is being bludgeoned over your head with. It allows the audience to come to its own thoughts and feelings about something throughout the movie, before in the end giving that final line to tie it back to this is what the point is. King of the Monsters, at basically the start of the movie, comes out and says humanity is destroying the Earth and we need to be purged to save the Earth. Which, again, Emma at the end of the movie is found out to be entirely wrong, meaning the entire movie is kind of antithetical to the point it seems to be trying to make. For a movie that handles this sort of idea, in fact, the exact same concept of kaiju being used as essentially a stand-in for environmental change, is Pacific Rim. The aliens are seeking to terraform Earth. However, that one just does it a lot more tactfully and clever, since you know that kaiju blue, which is the blood of the kaiju in Pacific Rim, is very ammonia-based. That is toxic to humans. This makes sense, as from another planet, something would have an entirely different biological system because they would have developed under different circumstances and different conditions. It also helps that kaiju blue is toxic to humans. It poisons our environments, making it harder for us to survive. Now, as we find out later in the movie, humanity living and humanity doing things has made Earth more hospitable to the aliens, and they were just using us to essentially terraform the Earth for them, with some assistance from their own kaiju coming in, destroying things and weakening our defenses, so that they can come in and take over everything. Thing is, we don't find out about that until basically the end. And it isn't spoon-fed hammered to you. You kind of have to, one, have a little bit of an understanding of chemistry and science to understand it, and second, it's not belabored. It's sort of an extra layer of understanding that if you understand it, it makes the movie a lot more clever than the kind of dumb action kaiju film it is somewhat represented as, and if you don't, you can just enjoy the movie as a good kaiju blockbuster. You can't really do that with King of the Monsters. Mixed with, again, the fact that Emma's wrong at the end of the movie. As well as the fact that she is, well, wrong about a lot of things throughout the entire movie, namely, that King Ghidorah is going to try and help Earth, which doesn't. And again, at the end of the movie, Earth was actually imbalanced the entire time. It was her actions that upset it by waking up King Ghidorah, so again, it's hard to tell what the point of the movie was trying to get across. And the worst part about it is that it uses King Ghidorah as this instrument. If they weren't trying to go for this idea, it's very unlikely they would have picked King Ghidorah. And even if they did want to go with this idea, other kaiju simply would have been better fit for it. Yeah, that was a bit of a lot. There was a myriad of bad decisions that went into King of the Monsters' portrayal of King Ghidorah, a lot of it involving, everything from the start to the end of the process of making the movie, and something about the representation of the character. As well as the way that they actually just handled things going on after the movie ended and continued on with sequels. But that is not all that there is. There is a lot of good that was done with this version of King Ghidorah, despite many of the failings. The best of this is actually something that Toho themselves was almost completely unable to do. Legendary's portrayal evolved the character from well beyond his Toho roots, to a degree that really only Rebirth of Mothra 3 ever even came slightly close to doing, and that one never even really showcased him to the same degree as a true threat. MonsterVerse King Ghidorah, they show the true grandeur, the scope and scale of King Ghidorah as a rival to Godzilla in terms of presence, in terms of his ability to threaten the entire world. A large part of this is the limitations of Suitmation and the advantages of CGI. The CGI allowed for much better, smoother motions and a much more emotive King Ghidorah. You can see individual expressions, individual emotions on each of the three faces. You can get far more aggressive battles than you could ever get with Suitmation. After all, take a look at Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah in the 90s with King Ghidorah stomping on Godzilla, versus King of the Monsters, King Ghidorah stomping on MonsterVerse Godzilla. It's complete night and day. While the overall plot and story requiring King Ghidorah's actions is, we've given our criticisms of it, the way the in-story presentation of it takes place is, bar none, some of the best. Comparatively silly idea of Rebirth of Mothra 3, where he is snatching up younglings and essentially draining their life force to power himself up, versus the walking, or rather flying, cataclysmic apocalypse that he is in this movie. You can see the massive storms he is creating, the pure devastation and destruction he is able to cause effortlessly. He comes off as a true and serious threat by being able to actually display power that you weren't really able to do with practical effects beforehand. It also returned King Ghidorah to his cosmic destroyer roots that he kind of lost throughout most of Toho's portrayal alongside Godzilla. The only time King Ghidorah was ever an independent intellectual entity prior to King of the Monsters in a movie alongside Godzilla was all the way back in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Every other movie, he was under the control of aliens or under the control of humans, since in GMK, the original creature King Ghidorah was, Yamato no Orochi, was slain by Japanese warriors in the past and was originally a hostile creature. It was the preying over the three dead guardian monsters, which the same was of Baragon and Mothra, by Japan's honorable dead, that their souls were able to get the bodies of those monsters to fight for Japan. GMK Ghidorah was never a good guy. It was simply the souls motivating it to defend Japan from Godzilla. Here, he actually seems to almost snark at the concept of trying to be controlled. It's almost like it is a deliberate jab at that age-old trope of Ghidorah being basically a alien or human flesh puppet. Which means that Legendary was able to do Toho's ideas for monsters far better than they himself had ever done. I very firmly believe that despite the flaws of King of the Monsters, this is going to be the gold standard of King Ghidorah going forward. As for being Godzilla's rival, this is another argument that I actually think is somewhat flawed, despite the fact that King Ghidorah is Godzilla's principal arch-rival. He is the monster that Godzilla has clashed with the most of all. Godzilla has fought King Ghidorah 11 different times, keeping in mind there's about 40 Godzilla movies. The next closest number of movies shared with a rival is Mothra at something around 5. Kind of going along with what was the first topic point, Ghidorah never saw Godzilla as a rival. It was always a meta-contextual thing, kind of like Sonic and Mario. But it was King of the Monsters that actually made this a character trait of the two of them, where they see one another as rivals. Or rather, King Ghidorah sees Godzilla as a rival. Godzilla simply sees King Ghidorah as a threat that needs to be destroyed. A particularly difficult one, but he has more than enough rivals in the MonsterVerse as is. But the complaint is often that Ghidorah was the biggest caliber rival Godzilla has, or biggest caliber monster Godzilla has in his library of kaiju enemies. This is nowhere near the truth. There are a number of King Ghidorah caliber rivals. Destroya, Space Godzilla is probably one of the biggest. Mechagodzilla, though they have already used him, and Bagon, despite the fact that he has not appeared in a movie, has long been something that was a Godzilla high caliber enemy. It's simply that King Ghidorah is his most famous and numerous rival. So this is really the community as a whole kind of being a little petty and really having a bit of a stick up their butt for really no reason. All of this is also further compounded with if Legendary continues to want to use the Toho library of monsters going forward. Something which they seem to be no longer really doing. I myself have been very critical of the idea of bringing in Destroya into the MonsterVerse, largely because the Oxygen Destroyer doesn't have the same power it did in the original series, and Space Godzilla as an enemy wouldn't really make sense given a number of things, but there are still a large number of high-caliber enemies in the Godzilla series, even if they aren't to the same King Ghidorah caliber. That is just as their typical portrayals go. Something like Gigan and Megalon could easily be competent high-tier threats. Orga as well. Another example being Batra. Batra is a much more offensive counterpart to Mothra. We already know Mothra is more or less an equal to Godzilla. The entire essentially wasting of Godzilla's rival in that they used up the biggest caliber threat and that King Ghidorah should have been this sort of Thanos level threat is completely nonsense. Now, should he have gotten a little bit of better setup? That I agree. I do feel he was rushed, but with the kind of arguments being made, the usage of King Ghidorah at all would have made people upset. Really, the usage of any of these monsters in whatever order would have made people upset. It's kind of a no-win situation for some people because they would have always liked to see certain monsters later, certain monsters earlier, and it's people having their head up their own butt. In terms of Ghidorah's lasting impact on the MonsterVerse itself, while yes, this has been almost heavily eroded to the point of non-existence, his lasting impact was Mechagodzilla. Now, the involvement of King Ghidorah in Mechagodzilla for MonsterVerse, that is something that can be criticized, and I feel if it is going to be criticized, it should be criticized for the right reasons. Oftentimes, it is simply down to Mechagodzilla should be a reflection of Godzilla, not King Ghidorah. Except for the fact that this is not even the first time that a King Ghidorah has been involved in the construction of a Mechagodzilla, which is literally the whole point of why this Mechagodzilla was made this way. It's a callback to Mechagodzilla 2. But second is that the entire origin of this one, in terms of the other half of it, more or less comes from Kiryu, which is generally seen as the favorite amongst all Mechagodzillas. Both are a skull, or rather skeletal remains, of a kaiju being built inside, or at least involved in the control system of a giant robot, which breaks free of its control, goes rogue, and ends up fighting against humanity. Now, the difference between Kiryu and Mechagodzilla MonsterVerse is that the Kiryu was the soul of the original Godzilla, inhabiting the mecha suit that is Kiryu, and just find peace and go back to the ocean and just go back to the afterlife. MonsterVerse Mechagodzilla is a lot of King Ghidorah's lingering resentments mixed with Apex Cybernetics control sequences and Ren Serizawa's hate for Godzilla, all lashing out to just want to game-end Godzilla and cause more and more destruction. At the end of the day, why is one backstory, despite being the exact same more or less, loved and the other hated? Mechagodzilla is simply humanity creating a reflection of Godzilla, oftentimes utilizing things we don't understand, and it ends up biting us in the butt. That's always been the way Mechagodzillas have been when they're made by humans. Things always go horribly wrong because we're harnessing a power we cannot possibly understand. Most of the issues reflecting on this in terms of writing are just problems of Godzilla vs. Kong's story. It was set up as simultaneously being incredibly obvious that it's Mechagodzilla, and also intended as a late movie plot twist that actually, surprise, surprise, Mechagodzilla all along, when we kind of knew this was coming, and also saw it coming, but also it wasn't really obvious at all. Despite actually being a fantastic implementation of a way for Mechagodzilla to be made in-universe, humanity wants a way to kill Godzilla, so why not use the skull of the thing that almost beat Godzilla, combine it with the same energy signature that is basically used to power Godzilla to power the machine. It's a concept that if it was done in a Toho movie, everyone would say was great and loved. It's simply the fact that it was made by an American studio that people don't like it. Now, it is also worth noting, it wasn't necessary for King Ghidorah to be involved in this. The Ren Serizawa and going rogue part with the Inner Earth energy was something that doesn't require King Ghidorah to be a factor. And unfortunately, it often leaves people fixating on the wrong symptom instead of the true problem. Since at the end of the day, Godzilla vs. Kong was kind of just meant to bring Godzilla and Kong together to fight and then at the end become allies. Since again, it's worth noting, they really didn't have a plan in the long run for this. They really just wanted to get to Godzilla vs. Kong, and that was their goal. And I would say that it was actually fairly successfully. The timing of King of the Monsters and King Ghidorah's presence in the movie, despite all of its not good executions, for certain meta-contextual reasons, I think actually is very important to the success of the MonsterVerse long run, and was something of a necessary evil for, lack of a better term, being a sacrificial lion. And this was somewhat entirely unintended when the movie actually came out. The movie itself came out in 2019. Avengers Infinity War came out in 2018. And in 2019, we also got Endgame. Those two movies, in addition to just the general dominance of Marvel at the box office, really took focus off of a lot of other movies. However, just simply due to sheer character reputation of Godzilla King of the Monsters having Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah in it, that rivalry between Ghidorah and Godzilla was able to let it endure better than other movies were able to. There's a myriad of other reasons King of the Monsters suffered and did poorly that year. Avengers Endgame is not the reason that that movie lost well over $100 million, but it is a partially contributing factor. But it was those presence within the movie that allowed it to weather the storm better than others and buoyed the MonsterVerse along just long enough for Godzilla vs. Kong to come out following it, which was not only one of the most successful movies during Kung Flu, despite the fact that it was one of the most successful movies released at the box office alone, when it was released synchronously on streaming and box office, while also being amusingly the most pirated movie of 2021. Despite the fact that King of the Monsters failed hard, its failure gathered a significant amount of interest in the MonsterVerse. Whether that was due to all the failures of the MonsterVerse, or simply the fact that Marvel burnout was actually starting to set in, and people were looking for another big series to go over to. After all, the kind of pulpy popcorn fun of the early MCU is somewhat characterized by a lot of the MonsterVerse films. It's very hard to imagine that kind of unintentional side effect would have happened had King Ghidorah not been in the movie. And then just look at how the MCU has fallen apart over the last 4 years. And last of all, for reasons that King Ghidorah wasn't a waste, as mentioned before, the MonsterVerse was basically just set up for Godzilla vs. Kong. They never had this decade-and-a-half long MCU-style Infinity War saga plan. While they were planning a movie or so in advance or some general ideas, at the end of the day, all they really wanted to do is get to Giant Dino fights Giant Monkey. Pair that up with the other overarching fact, something a lot of people don't really want to acknowledge is the case of the MonsterVerse. Toho is the ones that are really calling the shots. They could have pulled the plug at any point they wanted. This really doesn't get a lot of the spotlight because, as much as people want to criticize the MonsterVerse for not being Toho or not being a valid incarnation of Godzilla, Toho has to sign off on everything. If they didn't like it, it wouldn't happen, which is something else we'll be going into later. As much as I would love seeing a new Godzilla, Mothra, Kong, or even a Rodan movie every couple of months to, every other year, it'll sadly never happen. And as an audience, we really should not be treating every series like the MCU. Because, to be frank, nothing like the MCU is ever going to happen again. Look at DC and them trying to force something like that into existence. While I think that the MonsterVerse has the biggest potential to become something like that, ultimately, even in the end, there's just not enough monsters for it to really be done with. Part of the reason why they could put out movies so frequently for the MCU is because they had decades of comic stories to go on. If they tried the same thing with the Godzilla movies, they'd just end up remaking basically every movie. With their end goal being Godzilla vs. Kong in mind, and the ever-present potential for Toho to simply pull the plug, Legendary likely wanted to get Godzilla's biggest rival in the MonsterVerse before anything happened. While I do think that this is a bit of a reckless handicap on future plans, that only really matters if there were even future plans to begin with, or that they even cared about. As well as the end goal being Godzilla vs. Kong puts them in a bit of a difficult bind one way or another. Either they use Ghidorah basically straight out of the gate, again, kneecapping their plans for the future if they even had to or wanted to use him in the future, or just not use King Ghidorah, make Godzilla vs. Kong, and see if there is even still will for more Godzilla movies post Godzilla vs. Kong. Now, as we know, there was still will for it. But that was a choice that, how many years ago? 7, 8 years ago? They never could have known the answer to. It was a bad decision either way, and in the end, I kind of think that they made the better decision to use King Ghidorah rather than run the risk of never having gotten to use him in the first place. If that is the case, I would rather this Ghidorah, riddled with all of the flaws there are in King of the Monsters, than never having gotten them. I know that this was a very different style of video. I plan on making more videos like this, and hopefully a lot of those will be much better organized and put together than this one. So, once again, thank y'all for bearing with me. Let me know what I can do to improve this format going forward. When I first started making this video, I was actually very much in the stance of King Ghidorah was not wasted by the MonsterVerse. However, the more that I looked into it, and the more that I thought about it, I did come over to seeing that, yes, the MonsterVerse may not have made the best usage of King Ghidorah. They used him far too early. The biggest nail in this entire argument, or rather at least this debate, is that despite how catastrophically King of the Monsters crashed and burned, the MonsterVerse continued on. Had it ended there, yes, it would have been a very different story. At least we would have gotten King Ghidorah before it ended off. What it also means is that the MonsterVerse was never really in any danger from ending prematurely. And considering that, yes, the plan was to make Godzilla vs. Kong, they knew from the start that King of the Monsters was something of a burner movie. It was, kind of for lack of a better term, almost a glorified prologue. It never mattered, which makes sense considering how much of it has been almost dropped from relevance when it comes to the new movies. Yes, this does only account for Legendary's side of plans. Toho, again, could have pulled the plug at any time. They didn't, I think ultimately because they understood that, yeah, people like to see the action, fun Godzilla movies, and if they're gonna go on the route of making the more serious toned, darker Godzilla movies, as they had already made Shin at this point, the Netflix anime movies were being made, and at this time, very likely Singular Point was in production, it allowed them each to focus on one half of the major components of Godzilla. The Dark Destroyer and nuclear sentiments, and the basically global nuclear-powered superhero that saves the Earth from giant monsters that, people like to watch popcorn at. So yes, while it is Toho who remain in control of what really happened no matter what, it's hard to imagine that Toho wasn't for continuing the MonsterVerse, even a movie beyond Godzilla vs. Kong. Which means that, likely, they kind of knew King Ghidorah's inclusion was pointless. Or, again, just reflects that they don't really care because they don't have this preconceived Godzilla tiering list of enemy calibers that fans do. They're happy that people were able to see favorite monsters be used. It reflects an entirely different mindset. One which I think the fans need to adopt more of. So yes, another monster would have actually been a far better fit for King of the Monsters' tone and the narrative they went for, which, yes, it does suggest something a lot darker, which not gonna go into the full details on, because YouTube really doesn't like it when a channel, especially one this small, is talking about that. But at this point, I think that we kind of almost need to talk about that in a separate video. That's not going to be fun. But Legendary having made a movie with Godzilla's biggest rival is something that very likely they wanted to have checked off. Again, even if the movie itself and implementation was not the best, I am satisfied with what we got. Will I still critique it? Oh yeah. Will I say what was good about it? Also yes. Overall, was King Ghidorah used too soon? Yes. Though I disagree on that means he was wasted. It is entirely unlikely that we will ever see King Ghidorah in the MonsterVerse again. And that more than anything is I think what people are kind of upset about and why they kind of lash out at this idea. The building a concept up in your own head and then ultimately having it cut short is not really something a lot of people like. But that isn't necessarily the fault of the media itself. That is building up your own ideas, your own headcanons, and then having to confront that your headcanons are not reality. Misused as he was, I think the implementation for what he was excellent. They made the best of what was, in hindsight, a very bad situation, and even in the moment, something that they knew was probably not a good situation. Yes, we could have gotten a far better movie starring King Ghidorah had they waited. As a movie, I think King of the Monsters is bad. A lot of problems with it, but King Ghidorah, the character within that movie, is one of the few bright golden spots. I don't think it completely makes up for all the failings of that movie, but it certainly makes its existence bearable, and one that, despite everything, I am okay with King of the Monsters existing because it means that we were able to get, in my opinion, the best incarnation of King Ghidorah there has ever been. It is not often Legendary is able to top Toho when it comes to their own characters. King of the Monsters, King Ghidorah, is one of those instances. Blending actual character lore with meta-contextual reputation into an actual character incarnation is not something you see done in most series. And generally, if it is done, it's not done well. King of the Monsters helped buoy the MonsterVerse into Godzilla vs. Kong's release, which saw the MonsterVerse through the final stages of the collapse of the MCU. Just look at how the MCU has fallen apart over the last several years. A string of failed movies and TV shows with a few successes here and there, while the MonsterVerse had its darkest days during the brightest beacons of Marvel's success. That left people with the great movie in Godzilla vs. Kong, and yes, admittedly the rough around the edges with all of its problems in Godzilla, Kong, and the New Empire, was still a very entertaining and much better movie than most of what Marvel put out lately. Weathering that storm was something only possible because of King Ghidorah. So while there were certainly many missteps made, there are still certainly some positives that came along with it. Ultimately, I think that while a failure, there were still successes to be had, and by the same token, while in some ways a success, there were some major failures. Whether everyone individually thinks MonsterVerse King Ghidorah was a failure or a success will come down to them. Let me know your thoughts below. Comment, let me know if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more, and let us know what you'd like to see next time. I've been Max Allo, and long live the Kaiju King.